daily. So I said, hey, I might know a location we can meet at too. And so that's why you guys are all here. I'm teaching at DevBootCamp in Chicago for 6 weeks, just in town for that. And then I got back to Cincinnati after that. So by all means, if you're interested in talking about Angular training or Angular development or anything Angular, just come find me after the meeting. And then Super Chris on the Twitters if you want to reach out that way too. So, what we're going to do tonight, how many people are familiar with Meteor at all? Okay, so just a few people. So I'll kind of introduce Meteor, what it's all about, and then I'll talk about how it's a complementary fit with Angular. And we'll spend lots of time looking at code examples of how the two can fit together. We'll talk about a project called NG Meteor, which brings Meteor and Angular together and how to use that. And then, for those that are interested, after I do all the talking and looking at code, we can actually go through and try to build an Angular Meteor app together, presuming you have a laptop. Otherwise, maybe. All right, so let's go ahead and start. So I first wanted to start with why any of this is even interesting or important, why we should care about Meteor. So I became interested in looking at Meteor specifically, technologies like Meteor, after I worked for a while on a large, well, it wasn't even that large, but a Rails application with an Angular front end. And what I kept finding is if I needed to build a customer model on the Angular side, I needed to build a customer model on the Rails side, and the controller, and the model, and all the things. And if I wanted to change it, or change the way the relationships, or add a new kind of model, I needed to do it on the Angular side, and then on the Rails side, and then in the routes and the views, and all those things. And, you know, I think Rails brings a lot of value, and I'm definitely not trying to knock Rails. But to get going fast and build an application, it just feels like a lot of overhead. And I started wondering, is there a way we could build this kind of an application with less code? And that led me to investigate Meteor, which I'll talk about some. But as I looked at Meteor, as we'll see in a few minutes, Meteor kind of doesn't bring that much in the way of a front-end framework. And the example that I saw using Meteor were like using Backbone on the front end, which I kind of quit using a couple of years ago because I felt like there was a better option. So I really became intrigued with what if we could use Meteor and use all the things that it does that are awesome, but still use Angular, which is my favorite front-end framework. And so this is kind of, this presentation basically comes out of my experiments and research in all of that. So what is Meteor? This is kind of their little spiel, if you will. It's a simple environment for building modern websites. What took weeks in the festival now takes hours in Meteor. Pretty bold statement, but let's actually talk about what it really is. And basically what Meteor is, it runs on top of Node, so to use it, you're going to have Node on your computer. It uses MongoDB for persistence, and it also is real-time using WebSockets and a protocol that they've invented over top of WebSockets. So it's bringing together Node and Mongo and real-time using WebSockets. And the way that it works, I already mentioned WebSockets. Meteor makes everything real time, so if you change one thing on one client, you automatically see it on all of the clients that are connected to your application. That's automatically done through Meteor, as we'll see here in a second. And the way that actually works under the covers, if you're interested, is there's actually a pretty good article at MeteorHacks.com. But if you Google for try to break down the protocol in huge amounts of details, but it is actually really pretty simple under the cover. It's just sending back JSON messages in the case of the RPC version of it. In the case of the data version of it, which is mainly what we'll look at, it's basically sending down little packets of JSON to all the clients to say, hey, there was a new thing added, or hey, there was a new thing changed. And so it's actually pretty simple under the covers as far as what it's doing. So the Meteor documentation kind of describes these 7 principles that Meteor embraces. And I thought I'd just go through those really quickly. Data on the wire just basically refers to we're not going to send down views with the application in HTML and arbitrary things. We're just going to send data in the form of JSON back and forth over the wire. This is kind of an obvious thing. If you're building an Angular application, you're probably already down the well already. Angular kind of makes that the default way to go. One language, that's kind of interesting. So JavaScript is the one language, but I have an asterisk there because you can easily use CoffeeScript with Meteor as well. So that's kind of another language, but maybe not quite. But it does let you write JavaScript and not have to write separate JavaScript for the client and the server. So one language, but also not necessarily, it automatically lets you share code between client and server, which is very powerful and interesting. Latency compensation is something built into Meteor, and basically what it's doing is when you make changes to something in Meteor, as much as possible, you see the results immediately, and the application can go on, and if something happened when it actually persists to the server and it gets back a message later on, it'll let you know that. So it's not, in general, it's trying to let you go on with your application without having to wait for it to happen on the server. And this full-time reactivity thing is a little bit hard to explain until we get into some demos, so I'm probably going to wait to talk about that. But basically, reactivity is their description of what I would call binding being an Angular person. And one of the main things that I came across some code to do in this ng Meteor library that I'll be demoing is bridging the Meteor notion of binding with the Angular notion of binding. So Meteor wants to automatically, keep everything in sync for you, which is cool. But Angular also wants to automatically keep everything in sync for you, which is cool. But if you have 2 different things trying to keep everything in sync, well, that's not cool. You got to find some way to actually bring those together, and that's what ng Meteor actually does. You don't take away anything else. ng Meteor is bridging that gap. Pretty important. So embracing the ecosystem, they list that as one of their core values, but you can bring in NPMs and things and Bower modules pretty easily, but there's other senses in which your Meteor kind of wants to run and own your core application. So there were definitely some gotchas that we encountered as we started trying to build Angular Meteor apps, and I'll walk through what those are. So it tries to embrace the ecosystem, but there are definitely places where you have to not step on its toes or not work around it, stepping on your toes, so to speak. This last one, simplicity equals productivity. I might characterize that as ease equals productivity, or getting things done quickly. What it's doing is actually quite complex and interesting under the covers, but the API and the code that you have to write with it is really, really small and not very much. So it's very, very productive, and you'll see there's a lot of things that it gives you out of the box with very, very little code. And that, I think, is pretty awesome. So let's talk about the application structure for a Meteor app. When you first create a brand new Meteor app, there's almost no structure there for you yet. But as you build a more interesting Meteor app, there's 4 folders that you kind of need to be aware of. By default, if you just put a JavaScript file somewhere in a Meteor app, it's going to be served and available to both server and client-side code. But there are cases where you might not want that, and so there are a couple directories that are handled differently. Fairly self-explanatory. If you put anything under the server folder in your app, that code is only going to be packaged and run on the server in the node runtime. Similarly, client code, anything under the client folder of your app is only going to be served up to the client and is not going to be packaged into the server side code. So if you have code that only goes to anyone here, that's where you put it. And we'll do this when we actually start building an Angular Meteor app. We'll want that Angular code to go in the client-side code because it won't really, you want an Angular code in your node runtime. That doesn't really make any sense. Public, that's just like a folder like in a Rails app or any, there's lots of different other apps that use public folder. It just means you can serve anything under there from your Meteor app. Private is a folder that's not served, not bundled in the server or client code, but can be accessed by server-side code. So you have resources that you need to bundle with your app and access from your server-side code. You can put that in the private. So let's talk a little bit about Meteor collections. Meteor collections are basically kind of a thin veneer over Mongo collections. But the interesting thing about Meteor collections is they are available with both client and server side, for both client and server side. The way that they actually do that is with something called Mini-Mongo. Mini-Mongo is an implementation of almost all of the Mongo JavaScript API, but written in such a way that it can be used from the client as well as the server. So you can interact, as we'll see, with your Mongo collections from within your client code, just as if you had a direct connection to Mongo itself. And Meteor will take care of everything under the covers to make that happen. So that makes for some pretty easy to do application development. That's pretty cool. And so your Mini-Mongo Meteor collections, they are auto-published by default, and that is to make it really easy to get an application up and running real quickly. But it's really easy to turn that off, because as soon as you start building the real application, obviously you only want like a subset of Meteor in almost all cases available to the client, depending on what's going on. You don't want to share all the data for all the users in your application with whoever wants it. That would be very cool. But it does make it really easy to get started. So there's a module that a default Meteor application will ship with to auto-publish everything, and it's super easy to just like take that module out and just start going farther into your application.